Welcome back to Shop Talk for Season 5. I'm Brandi.
And this is James. We talk about all things related to mental health and cross-cultural workers.
So glad you're here. Welcome back to Shop Talk. We're glad you guys are here. We have a wonderful guest today that James is going to introduce to you.
Yeah, we're excited to have Kimberly Drage on, who is passionate about the well-being of cross-cultural workers. From her own experience serving in a closed country in Asia for 11 years and in Europe for another 8 years, where she currently serves, she has seen firsthand the connection between organizational practices and mental health for the people on the field. After becoming a coach, she began evaluating the models of care and support for cross-cultural workers and started asking what it would take to truly empower global workers to thrive in their work and lives. This question eventually led her to study management at the University of St. Andrews. She currently serves as the deputy director of the John Powell Institute at Mission Training International. JPI is working to connect research on well-being for cross-cultural workers to policy and practice for organizations. It is her hope that her work will inspire conversation and resource organizations when it comes to the central role organizations play in the well-being of cross-cultural workers, not just in member care services, but in organizational culture as a whole. Empowering organizations to be their best for those serving in them is vital to both global workers and the Great Commission, for we cannot honor the mission without upholding the people who are carrying it out. So great to have Kimberly on. She and I have worked around and connected to and with each other in various different ways. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Glad you're
Brandi, what are
here.
we talking about today?
Talking about organizational change. Dun, dun, dun. So,
See, I'm out. Trigger warnings for anybody listening.
right. So the organization that James and I are a part of is currently undergoing a fairly big change, and we've been able to interact with people at various levels of this change and see its impact, especially working in staff care and well-being. We hear a lot of stuff, and so I'm we were curious to talk to you about it today, Kimberly, and about just dynamics that impact change, how change is perceived at different levels of an organization, and what can be done if perhaps things are not handled well, what can be done to promote healing. So glad to talk to you about it today.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we could start off with just maybe some reasons of why organizations pursue change and what might be behind it.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of reasons that anyone, even if we come down to the individual level, says, hey, things need to be different. When you're talking about an organization, there's usually some problem that needs to be solved, a new person is in the mix. There's something, a reason for making a shift. And just like us as individuals, that could be all kinds of reason, all kinds of things behind the change. But when you're talking about an organization versus an individual, you've got a lot more moving pieces. And if it's just you thinking, hey, I'm ready for a change, you've already gotten to the pain point where it's worth letting go of what was to move into what you think will be better. Unfortunately, in organizations, that doesn't happen without work for everyone to be able to see and understand and get on board with whatever it is that's driving change. But without that, it can be very, very challenging to actually make the change and certainly to make the change successfully.
I'm pretty sure I've shared this with Kimberly before that sometimes organizational change, those ripple effects feel like a whip. So the people really close to the center that make little decisions only feel a little bit of movement. Oh, I just do from this to this, and but the further further down the chain you are, like on a whip, the more that I think the greater that swing tends to be and feel, and sometimes it has a quick pop at the end. So
I don't know if it's helpful to use this metaphor, but maybe just going with that, this idea of the brains of the organization
Mhm.
have often had more time to just simmer on this. They know the rationale behind why a change is being made or why we need to make this movement. But unfortunately, like the human body or unlike the human body, those communication channels that get all the way from the brain out to the fingers, without intentionality, there can be some just massive disconnects. And maybe just continuing with that metaphor, if the hand doesn't know why you're asking it to do this thing, or it feels like, I don't want to do that thing, and it's not connected to the rationale, or even more importantly, that there's buy-in to that rationale, it becomes really difficult out at those further edges you're talking about, James.
You mentioned a good point that the central brain has been stewing on this and working on it for a while. So for them, it's often not new.
Right.
It makes sense. They spent a lot of time and investment in this, but that doesn't always get communicated, like you said, down to the hands or to the toes, where it just feels like, what's
What?
happening here?
Why are we going this way? Why are we doing?
Right. And there's a disconnect between the head saying, no, we've been like this, we've been put a lot of thought into this. And then the hand's like, I don't see the thought. This feels
Right.
like, very sudden. So
Well, and I think that brings us to a fundamental piece of the whole puzzle, which is change always, always, always includes loss. And when you're talking loss in human beings, you as, care people know, what is that? Grief.
Hmm.
So you've got a grief journey, and people need to know what is worth it enough for me to experience this loss, whatever the loss is.
And perhaps an invitation from an organization to find ways to do that collectively for some of those shared losses. It just helps give a language to it. I mean, Henry Levinson said all change has loss, all loss needs to be grieved. So I think a lot of times, because there's a lot of excitement in organizational change as people are looking ahead, and for some people, visionaries, people that are good at dreaming and envisioning and moving, they're excited because this next thing is really cool and new and there's opportunities. And I think because of that, for others who are in different places of navigating grief, feel don't necessarily like there's room for that.
mm,
Yeah,
mm.
I think that is spot on. And again, when you're looking at a complex organization with lots of moving parts, you've got to make room for everyone and how they're showing up. And unlike other places where we experience loss or we're expecting grief, sometimes because of the complexity and how many moving parts there are, it's hard to even know what's going on for yourself. You might even miss that, oh, I am going through a grieving process,
Mm.
or even giving yourself permission, like, oh, I get to grieve, because you're trying to hop on board with this dynamic leader who's so excited, or, there could be all kinds of things happening for you.
I
Yeah.
wonder if it could help if the leadership would normalize the change and grief process, like from the get-go, if they could say, hey, here's change. Change is coming, and we recognize that this is going to be hard, something you're probably going to grieve over. Like, do you think that would help?
Oh, absolutely. So, and maybe it would help for me to kind of locate where I come into this conversation. So,
Sure.
I am not an expert on organizational change. I have walked it with a number of organizations. I have walked some very difficult organizational change. And I would say where I do land as far as bringing some kind of expertise is my passion really is about the organizational impact on well-being for cross-cultural workers. And this fits squarely in that space. But like all of us who are leaders in this space, we rely on other resources. We're learning from each other. And my go-to for organizational change is William Bridges. And Bridges makes a very important distinction from the get-go, and that is change is not the same thing as transition. So change, and this, I think it's getting just at what you're talking about. Change is the external different thing, whatever it is. New boss, new process, new division, new merger, whatever it is, that's out there. You can put that in a project management board. You can have timelines for when it's all rolling out. And that is usually where the organization is quite active. They're making things move. So if you can kind of make this leap with me to differentiate that external thing that's taking place within the organization from the internal journey that is happening for every human being connected to the change. And so Bridges would name that as transition and have us conceptually actually think of those as two separate
Mm.
processes that are happening in parallel. So, yes, you can, as an organization, do all of these external things to move whatever the thing is forward, but then you have this very human journey of transition that is normalizing and acknowledging the grief, making room for it, being intentional about narratives around what's happening, working to get, I mean, I don't know if, I know we're going to go into how would you do change well. This is kind of a menu, but one of the things certainly is to help people even recognize that they are experiencing loss and grief. And again, as care people, crazy things come out when we're going through grief. You don't you don't see the world quite the same way. So now you've got a community of grieving people who don't even realize they're grieving, bonking into each other and into the leadership that's very excited about this new thing that's happening.
Yes.
You can
And
make
for
it.
the leadership, it's their baby. And so
Right.
they might feel protective of it and they're excited about it. And so there's that disconnect, like we've talked about with the people who are bunking up against each other.
But I think just what you've said, I mean, if I don't know if I'll stand behind this, but for 1 second, I'll at least say if you could only do one thing as a manager in change, it might actually be to just recognize the process you're in and normalize that grief kinds of things are going to show up in this space.
Good.
Yeah, I can think often I've sat with leaders helping give them feedback of what people's experience are, either as a counselor or a staff care provider. Here's some of what I'm hearing. Here's how people are experiencing the change. And I think genuine surprise on their face and like, what? That's not what we meant at all, was for that impact. But yeah, there's, I think, an opportunity for leaders to be more mindful of that process.
Yeah.
I think people who are tend to be in leadership tend to be visionaries and those who can push forward and push forward well. But then what might be lacking there is an ability to connect, that inability, a difficulty in connecting, with the feelings of those that it's impacting. I wonder where to go first with this. If we could talk about maybe what happens when change is not handled well, and then maybe ways that change can be implemented well. What do you
Mhm.
guys think?
You want to do the negative one first? You doing good news or bad news? You want the bad news first? Is that what you're saying?
Just wondering. We can end on a high note.
Oh, sure, I'm in. Let's talk about some pitfalls.
Yeah, well, I think we've talked about a lot of them already, or just some
Right.
major conceptual ones. One, that the leadership is often locked in, they're excited, they've actually had a runway for, imagining, dreaming into, understanding how this is all going to roll out and play out. They're already bought into why this is such a great idea and why it's worth it to do this. So what happens is you get, again, going back to that metaphor, sort of this thinking part of the organization way out ahead of the rest of the organization. And if there's not a sensitivity to that, then again, you run into what quickly turns into some kind of clash,
Mm,
frustration and inability to be tracking together. And maybe then, because of all the things that are mixed in, actually becoming more difficult to find each other. So, particularly if you don't have a sense of what is going on here, that it just, um, it can be really tricky really quickly. I think for, again, organizational leaders who tend to be very excited, and we mentioned before, maybe even protective about this idea, a little bit defensive, maybe about moving things forward, can feel threatened by the thought of slowing down and tending to the human process. I didn't mention this before, but I kind of set myself up for it. You know, when you're thinking about change, you can put that in a project management diagram, or, you know, Trello or whatever. You got this, you can block it out. Here are the dates. Here's when this desk moves over there and this person does that thing. Grief is not like that. Loss is not like that. So,
Right? You can't put that on a Trello board.
no, you cannot put grief on a Trello board. And I know grief can sometimes feel like a very heavy word depending on the level of transition. But it's true. It really is grief, and it really is people's daily lives. So even I remember our organization rolled out a new accounting software. And I was so annoyed. I was
Yeah.
like, I'm gonna have to spend a day figuring out a whole new process. You know, I'm annoyed. I had my whole like accounting set up. I knew how to do this. Suddenly I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how any of it works, and I really don't want to spend a day figuring this out. You know, over something that small, I was able to lock in and be like, oh, this is organizational transition. I'm experiencing loss. I am irritated. You know, I am angry about that. Like I'm going through the steps of grief right now. You know, so not having that awareness, which is so common, or even minimizing, is this actually a loss? Can I
Mhm.
actually be sad about this? It feels kind of silly that I'm been out of shape over an accounting program. But going back to this sense that maybe where James was going, these sort of ripple effects, like one little change in one part of the organization actually has a lot of ripples to it. So to just, I guess we're on the negative, to ignore those ripples or minimize those ripples, what Bridges would say is it's just gonna come back. It's just gonna come back stronger. So,
True.
yeah, those are a couple of things that come to mind. Maybe the last
Kim,
one I would add is allowing people to be human beings. I was just talking to a friend today who's going through some really tricky organizational change on a pretty small scale, but it affects her role very deeply. And she said, "You know what? I am not a role. I
Mm.
am a, I am a person." And so sometimes leaders can fall into the trap of looking at their organizational chart and moving things around very excitedly, thinking about a new vision without remembering there's people in every one of those places. And as that moves, every one of those people is experiencing loss. Even good
Mm.
change initiates loss. So,
absolutely. I think if people could really sit with a no from the get-go in leadership whenever they're instigating change, this is grief is going to be part of this, and that's normal. And if they can recognize that from the get-go, I think that would maybe be helpful in them receiving feedback, receiving the processes of the people that they're leading. Just when you mentioned accounting software, just as a side note, we like changed our expense, how we file our expenses. What was it, a year ago, James?
Oh yeah, a
Um,
couple years.
my initial thought was, I'm out. I'm out. I'm done. Not doing this. Grief.
but what I would say is that's so normal. And
It's
the
normal.
other thing is when you know, when you yourself start saying things like, "Oh, new accounting software, I'm out," you you know what to do with that. You're like, "Okay, no major decisions today. I'm just feeling it."
Yes.
So normal. Yeah.
If I were to borrow something out of a dissertation that was recently written, as
Wait, who
things,
wrote the dissertation?
as things to be careful of, one of them in this process would be triangulation,
Yes.
and that's where, in particular, there is something. It could be a person, it could be a procedure or policy that's kind of people shift their focus onto that as a thing that's bad and needs to be changed or cut off. And sometimes in that there's deeper rooted things that aren't addressed. So it's a bit of a scapegoat. So there's certain times I think when organizations can do this to try to solve a problem, and it's fixing it on the surface level as opposed to some of the deeper rootedness that's underneath. And in that, I think there's a opportunity that power can be misused, that's hidden and obscured, and sometimes stuff isn't communicated with everybody, so different people know different amounts, which is sometimes you have to for HR reasons, but it's hard for people to understand. So there's ways in the midst of that, as we talk about potential pitfalls, that I think just think organizations need to be careful, both how they think through change and how they begin to communicate it as they're being mindful, as Kimberly said, of there's actually people in that process. And often in transition, people do get frustrated and leave, which is extra loss. And then sometimes things can just be blamed on them as opposed to thinking through some of the deeper parts that were a part of that process. So I think as an organization faces perhaps challenges or pushback or discomfort in that, there's a tendency that as a policy or a person changes to just be like, well, that was the problem. Let's just move on. And we call that kind of triangulation or scapegoating. And it can be really, really unhelpful for the organization because it doesn't address some of the deeper underlying stuff, whether it's like in my dissertation, historical trauma, or uh, systemic kind of problems and unhealth that have been festering under for a really long time and might not be related to the change or transition, but also aren't being addressed ongoing.
Yeah, as I hear you talking, James, I think it just comes to mind that leadership and how people lead is so it's so vital to well-being for people in any organization. That is in the research through and through. That's pretty airtight. You have a huge influence through how you lead. And if you are a leader who's leading through change, expect game on. Like we need your
Mm.
very best leadership through this season. And that means your very best integrity, your very best getting really at the heart of what needs to be uncovered or sorted through, not one of these how do we just kind of short circuit to a new day? I mean, no, we need best thinking, best leadership, best communication, best
Mm.
transparency, best integrity, because when those pieces start shifting, everybody needs to know they can trust you walking through this. So absolutely agree with what you're saying, James.
If I were to offer some words from Diane Langberg, who talks a lot about kind of power and abuse, she goes, even amid the challenges of organizational policy or structure, there may be a way for power to be redeemed through transparency and clarity, ultimately leading organization and its members to deeper relationship with Christ. Jesus used this as an example by using his power to protect, expose, and restore dignity, and then calls on us as his followers to do the same. So there's also great opportunity, I think, in that.
I just want to give a little shout out to, so in my management program here at St. Andrews, I kind of came in as a believer and I was like, I'm going to be the moral compass here, guys, you know. So, and I
Good
was
for
quickly
you.
humbled. Well, I was humbled by um, a culture of we want you to be the most integrous business leaders out there. And what was so interesting to me, and this is a little bit of a side path, but in another way, no, they were very committed to teaching us how to be ethical leaders. And their number one methodology for that was journaling,
Mm. Wow.
reflective practice. So actually paying attention to what you're doing, what the organization is doing, what assumptions are behind that, so that when you get in some of these dilemma places, is that's what I hear you describing, James, that you recognize you're in one of these dilemma places and you can actually see your way to the brave kingdom value kind of move. So just a little side note, slightly off track of organizational change, but definitely about ethics and
Mhm.
leadership.
No,
So reflective practice, journaling, paying attention.
yeah, I really like that. If those instigating change can have those practices in place where they are listening to themselves and paying attention to what's going on in their processes as they're hearing from other people too, I think would be so beneficial. I want to shift a little bit to think about people who are on the receiving end of change. What are some things that they may do or attitudes or things that aren't helpful?
Oh,
Like
that
we've talked about leadership, but then
Oh,
like people on the
followership.
receiving end.
Yeah.
Followership, yes.
yes. Oh, man, this is a different angle because I think I have a lot of empathy for people who are following through change. And if there isn't a culture of awareness, I almost just give 100% empathy.
Right.
Um, because the thing is, we don't know the specific change, but there is sort of an anatomy of a change process. And I'm gonna go back to William Bridges. Um, he's got a really basic model. It's not linear. These things are happening in parallel, but basically at the beginning, you've got a bunch of people dealing with a lot of loss and grief and letting go. People hate letting go. We like things to stay the same. So, right off of the bat, I just have so much empathy for that group of people if they don't have awareness, particularly. And I probably am a little bit stubborn about anything that looks like blind followership. Maybe doing your own reflective practice, doing your own reading on organizational change. Um, but even, and maybe that is one of the things you can do is to know this roadmap. You know, you're going to be dealing with loss. Then you go into the wonderful space of this very messy in between where nobody is losing anything anymore. It's just not been created. So it's really disorienting. And you're trying to, as an organization, figure out what the new normal is. So that is an amazingly creative and generative space because there's all these moving parts. It's a completely disorienting and frustrating space because there are all these moving parts. So you go into that with your colleagues, and then you start building this third part, which is the new beginning. Things do start settling down. This is funny. I think there's so many things in when we're talking about cross-cultural ministry that we know because we train about transition, right?
Hmm.
But we don't necessarily apply it in these other contexts. We apply them in a particular context. So I'm just thinking about this as things start settling back in again, you get a new normal, you get comfortable again. I mean, that's pretty happy. People are feeling good there. But when you're talking about the first two phases, there's just a lot of either grief or disorientation and frustration. So again, I think knowing the roadmap is what I would say. Being aware. And then from that place of awareness, you're in a much better place to do self-care, to do some self-filtering, to know when you are really put off by what the leader has just said. Or if you're listening to a colleague that's really upset, you can tell each other, oh, we're in it. Like here we are. We're in this glorious in between where that leader doesn't know. And you can somehow find your compassion by having a narrative that helps you interpret what's happening.
And I would just caution people to be careful of negative attribution, where we kind of just start assuming people have had bad intentions and to move towards, and this is a hard thing to do, so it's easy for me to say here, but that attitude of grace towards the fact that many of the leaders in our faith organizations, especially, are people of deep faith and calling and have spent time in discernment. And I sometimes have to remind myself and other people, both as a leader but also as a care professional, of that fact and being like, actually, I've sat with leaders before and they have wept as they have talked about this change that they could not avoid because of all of these other external things and how much time they spent praying and thinking about it. And to also be like actively practicing the habit and the practice of grace towards people and in the midst of doing all of those other things too, I think is helpful. It's a part of, I think, a calling as a follower, which we are also have. There's research out there on followers, just like there is leaders.
And I would say, ironically, it's even how much intentionality these leaders put in that can
Mm,
even drive the disconnect, right? Because they're so shocked when it doesn't land well,
right.
especially if you don't have this just really basic roadmap of why this isn't staying together as you might have hoped. So, yeah, absolutely, James.
I also think about one transition that you were you know about that I wasn't there but heard about later, and I'm kind of like, how did you think this was going to go? At the same time, all that
It's
said, lots of
also
grace,
those.
lots of positive attribution at the same time. In what way was this possibly a good idea? But
I will say, I just went through a very difficult organizational transition that ended in the ending of an
mm,
organization. And there were so many days that were so hard. And often I would confide in my husband, Dan, and I was at the same time I was writing about organizational change. I was blogging for our organization about what to expect through organizational change. And he would just gently say, hey, going back to what you've been saying, Brandy, about normalizing, he'd be like, you sound like you're going through change, and just have those people around you who can help you remember this will be uncomfortable. You are not off on some strange place. Yes, you're doing it. And I think for me, that does oftentimes when I'm feeling pain, I want to know who to blame, right? So that does help me find a way to get behind my leadership and recognize that they're not out to get me or to get what I care about, but they're people too.
I wonder what steps can be taken. So say maybe change isn't implemented so well, and there's been like a lot of pain in the process. I wonder what can be done in an organization to help repair the
Yeah.
damage that was made.
The thing that keeps coming to mind as we're talking is the power of narratives. And, we're talking about how, a leadership team or a leader can get disconnected for their people as they're leading through change. There is always an invitation to find a narrative that helps you reconnect, to find a way to think about, talk about what is happening in the organization and where those gaps are so that you can start naming them. So you can start saying, okay, I see you're not a role, you're a human being. What are the losses you're experiencing? I want to be with you in this. And again, I think even as we're talking, I hope it's becoming clear there's a lot of very innocent, no ill intention whatsoever ways that that disconnect can happen and where people feel lost in organizational change. It's a tragedy in one sense, but it's also an asset because that invitation to say, oh, we've disconnected, how do we find each other again, is always there. But it probably means slowing down for the leader. And that is a big loss for them, or that may be more than they're ready to to say yes to you. I think it also just going back to when you have leaders that are really intentional and have taken time, it can feel like a big blindside to have people not jump on board as quickly as they expected. So I think if there's a leader that's seeing, wow, we really did miss our people, I believe there's always an invitation to say, wow, we've missed. How do we come back, name these losses together, help repair as much as we can in terms of, like, one of the things William Bridges talks about is if there's a loss, can we compensate it in some other way? Is there a creative way to to make up the gap or fill something where something else feels lost or must be lost? But I think it starts with that posture of saying this connection is important to me and to us as an organization, so much so that I'm gonna find you in this mess. And let's find each other. Yeah.
because so many organizations are working virtually or remote or in different countries and contexts, and there's different cultures involved. Sometimes it's putting money towards an in-person thing because trust, I think, is built quicker, not necessarily in a quicker versus slower way, but more efficiently, maybe when you're in person and you can see somebody and experience them and share some of that space and share some of those frustrations and the hopes and the sometimes that's worth slowing down the process of change and transition to do something in person to bring people together and say, wow, let's be with each other and let's hear what's been hard and talk about it. And you could also do that before, perhaps preventatively, but certainly repair is possible. So I think that it would be an expenditure I could think of that would be like time and money real well spent in the act of repair. And, we're called to the ministry of reconciliation. So that could be a way of doing it.
I think too, it's funny in organizations in general, but maybe particularly in these places of tension or difficulty, there can be an overuse of these big public spaces, big emails or a big Zoom meeting with
Right.
everybody, where let's lean into relationships. So I would say, where are those immediate supervisors? Is there a way to meet with them, help them get on board, and relationally connect with all these people further out? Use your relational capital, if you will, or the strengths you have in your organization. Because if trust has been broken, the way to repair it is it's a relational brokenness. And the way you want to repair that is a relational space. So, how can you use those spaces? Yes, gathering would be amazing. But again, imagining how can we relationally connect with and meet our people and
Mm.
help repair this.
And we wouldn't be in this business if we didn't believe in repair, that
Mhm.
it's
Amen to
possible. So,
that.
yeah. Kimberly, you mentioned, I think before the podcast started, that you have some recordings of some business leaders who have talked about change and how they had kind of looked back and reflected back on the change and things they would have done differently. And we plan on having this in our show notes, but I wonder if there's a couple of general themes that you've heard from these leaders.
Yeah, actually, it was funny listening to these interviews because I didn't get to speak to people. We just gave them some questions and they sent
Mm.
back recordings. So, one of the main themes that came out was pace, to slow down. It takes more time than you think it's going to take to get everyone on board. And again, if we go back to sort of the anatomy of why, it's because transition is this human, messy process that isn't on a timeline, which is frustrating when you're trying to implement change, but to recognize those are happening in parallel. So pace, slowing down was a theme. Another theme was to communicate, 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 communicate. You cannot over communicate. And that just reminds me of that earlier point we were discussing of this is a time for your very best leadership, your very clearest communication. Yeah, that was another piece. And I think also, again, in this excitement and vision and seeing where this is going and knowing it is good for the organization, there can be a blindness to the cost of not slowing down. And that also came out from these leaders. Just realizing in retrospect, man, we ended up losing a lot by not going through this more carefully.
I had a leader tell me recently that he heard that the best thing to do was just rip the Band-Aid off.
It's one way to do it.
That's an option.
A big band-aid.
Yeah. People get mad and get over it, and then you can move on, as opposed to like a long drawn out process.
Man, I just like to really wonder what's happening in the people move on. What's underneath their silence or their compliance that isn't being spoken, but is definitely shifting the culture of an organization.
The grief doesn't just go away, even if, the machine is pushing forward, still there.
And the
Mm.
trust is, if you're a leader, that's at least for me, when I think about leadership, there's not much else that has as much meaning to me as the trust of the people who are following me.
Especially if people are a greatest resource.
Yeah, whenever I read your biography, that last sentence was just, I'm going to look at it again because it was just so good. Empowering organizations to be their best for those serving in them is vital to both global workers and the Great Commission, for we cannot honor the mission without upholding the people who are carrying it out. Yeah.
If I'm not experiencing the good news in my organization, it's going to be really hard to share it where I am.
Yeah. How we work matters, not just what we do.
Kimberly, as we're wrapping up, do you have any resources you'd like to share about change management? And we'll put it in our show notes, but just anything you want to mention here while we're talking.
I really like William Bridges' managing transitions, but there are so many resources out there. And that's kind of also a tragedy. Leaders, you don't have to do this alone. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So I would just say, everybody's got a different style and what they like and what they don't like. There's a lot on organizational change. Please don't do this with YouTube, duct tape, and bubblegum.
Don't MacGyver it, as we would
Yes,
say.
somebody has done this before, in fact, and they've written about it.
Yes.
I really appreciate your compassion and your gentleness and love for people in the whole process of organizational change and your desire for people to be heard and understood in it. So
Absolutely.
Well, Kimberly, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate your insight and tell us just a little bit about the initiative you're involved with MTI.
Yeah, so I'm a part of something called the Shared Foundations Initiative, and this is an opportunity for people in the Great Commission community to actually articulate together what are the aims and language that we use when we think about well-being for cross-cultural workers. And what's fascinating to me is that we don't yet have a shared space where we've articulated this already. And one of the things that makes this compelling to me is in the little bit of research we've done at JPI, one of the things we've noticed is that every time there's a new CEO in a sending organization or a new person heading up member care, the first year is spent defining what they're doing. That is
What
a
is
broad
member care?
generalization. That is a broad
That's it.
generalization. But so don't say there's like, this quantitative study behind what I'm saying. But generally, there's a sense of people having to recreate what we already know, what we already have out there. And so the idea behind the Shared Foundations Initiative is actually to bring the voices of wisdom in member care and development together so that we can create a shared voice. And that can be a starting place for organizations rather than recreating every cycle of organizational change. So the hope is to have something that can really serve member care and development so that they can get on with doing the work rather than trying to figure out what they're doing.
Sounds awesome. Sign me up.
Please join us. Join us.
you and Kristen talked, a lot yesterday. So
Yes,
you don't hear me a whole lot, but when you do, it doesn't sound great. Well, James knows everyone, so
Yeah, true.
that is my theory. It's
Expert.
6 degrees of James, and
Awesome.
Dr.
we
James.
worked to. I kind of just live to make James's life a little more difficult or interesting. I think I'm
You're
doing a
crushing
good
it.
job.
Yeah.
Welcome back to. See, here we go. Okay.